Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Dogman. My Dear Scary Stories NYC, my dog Jeb and I have spent a large percentage of this past year's lockdowns camping. Sometimes we paired up with close friends. Other times we camped alone. I'd still be out there right now, but I tried camping in the cold, and I just couldn't adapt to it. Some people can, but I couldn't. It's funny how a drop in temperature of a few degrees matters more to me than the fact that I had a dogman walk directly into my camp and interact with me one night. I already knew I might get attacked by a bear or a wolf or a big cat or some human kind of predator, and I accepted that possibility before pitching my first tent. But camping in the cold, to me, is worse than being in prison, so I may as well just go back to the city and stay inside my apartment. At least it's warm there. A lot of the time, anyway. So I'm writing this to tell you about the time my dog, Giant Spider Monkey, and I met a dogman in the flesh. I'm just going to call the dog Spider to save me some time typing, if that's all right. He is a gray-colored Great Dane, a very large creature, and usually pretty fearless. Mostly, though, his reputation is for being a very silly and funny dog, and I never introduced him to anyone that he hasn't become friends with. When we were camping in the summer, I always slept with my sleeping bag unzipped and my feet sticking out. On especially sweaty nights, I sometimes would have my feet sticking all the way out of the tent flap. Spider sleeps either just outside the tent or just inside, depending on his personal preference, so I assumed I would get a fair warning if any type of creature or person came close to my exposed feet while I was sleeping. Usually any living thing larger than a housefly that gets within 200 feet of our campsite will get greeted by loud, nervous barking from my close personal friend Spider. I know this because his barking would wake me up. Then, when he thought I had slept long enough in the mornings, Spider would lick my feet to wake me up. I mean the bottom of my feet to start with, which really tickles. I always kick him away and I try to go back to sleep, but that's when he starts licking the tops of my feet, which is just gross and I can't stand it. That always succeeds in getting me up. Sometimes I can pull my feet back into the sleeping bag and get a little more rest, but usually the dog wins, and I get up and get started on my day. On the night that I'm writing to you about, it was very warm. It was this past summer, and we were camping in New Jersey, a little north of Vineland. We were out away from anybody and hadn't seen any humans for days. I didn't have any friends with me for this trip. It was just me and Spider. I was sleeping with my bare feet sticking out of the tent opening, and when I passed out, I remember Spider was sleeping outside. It was too warm for us to sleep all that close to each other, and he usually stayed outside on the hotter nights anyway. At some point, long before I wanted to get up as usual, I felt the familiar ticklish feeling of a dog tongue licking the bottom of my feet. I called Spider by his full name, which I only really do when he's in trouble, and I kicked madly and blindly toward his nose to get him to stop. In other words, our nightly ritual. I still hadn't opened my eyes as I felt exhausted and was very devoted to the idea of sleeping a little more. The thing is, this time when I kicked my dog's snout away, he didn't back off as usual. Instead, I heard an angry growling sound, and that snapped me to attention. I opened my eyes to see why the friendliest, goofiest dog in the world suddenly turned feral, and I was immediately struck by two things. First of all, it was not morning. It was still dark out. Second of all, my dog was in the tent with me, cowering in the corner up by my head, as small as he could make himself, and staring at the tent flap with fear in his eyes. Suddenly terrified, I pulled my feet back in just as a huge dog head reached almost a foot into the tent, snapping at my toes. Imagine a canine cranium the size of a horse's head, but with rows of savage-looking meat-eating teeth lining both the top and the bottom. I nearly lost half my foot before I understood what was happening. In response to seeing that dinosaur-sized wolf snout entering our tent, Spider blew up, barking and sticking his head out of the tent to bare his teeth at the much larger, much wilder, much more frightening dog. Now it was my turn to be huddled as small as I could make myself in the furthest corner from the tent flap, watching my amazing dog defending me against a far larger opponent. He hid from the wild beast for as long as he could, but since that giant dog seemed to be deciding to attack us, Spider was bravely willing to make his final stand in my defense. Watching him barking wildly and insanely outside that tent flap made me feel truly embarrassed by my own cowardice. It didn't make me stop cowering in the corner of the tent, but now I felt embarrassed about it. Spider had his head and shoulders out of the tent and was making the loudest racket I'd ever heard him make when I heard the larger beast back off, and I watched my dog fully exit the tent to bark at him further. I got scared he would run off chasing the thing and I'd never see my dog again, so I poked my head out of the tent to see what was going on. Spider was not running away. He was holding his position in front of the tent, guarding me and watching. It was then that I looked where my dog was looking, and I saw in the moonlight, outlined in silhouette against the lighter colored trees beyond it, an upright walking creature. I gasped and thought I was going to be sick because I thought I was seeing a second figure in the night. I looked around madly for that dog, the large-headed dog who had almost bit my foot in two. I didn't see it anywhere around us, though. Just before the dark, upright walking silhouette re-entered the woods it had clearly come out of, it turned, bent down into a hostile posture, and barked angrily just as the big dog head had. Spider went crazy, barking madly, and I grabbed his collar to hold him from running off. The silhouette continued to bark for a few seconds longer, and I finally made the connection that this was in fact the same dog that had stuck its nose in my tent. It was an upright walking dog. I don't know exactly how tall it was, but it's bigger than Spider is when he stands on his hind legs, and he's taller than I am when he does that. This Dogman was also a lot thicker than Spider. I mean, as in muscles, as in bulk. It didn't look like Spider does when he stands up to hug me. It looked like it was comfortable walking on its hind legs, the same as humans are. I don't really remember if I even saw it well enough to see if it had a tail, or if its legs were more like the hind legs of a dog or the legs of a primate. I do remember broad shoulders, and I remember seeing the outline of ears standing up on top of its head. I don't think it was a big guy wearing a Batman mask. I think it was the same thing as what was licking my feet earlier. I felt kind of in a state of shock for the rest of the night. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't really. It was so hot with me and Spider both inside the tent, and the flap zipped all the way down. But I didn't want to risk anything getting in at us because Dogman licked my feet. Don't click away. We've got the last Dogman story of 2020 coming up in a minute. But first, I've got this new rhyme. Cheryl from Boston, a name to get lost in. We'd be imperiled without thee, dear Cheryl. Happy New Year, everybody. Please join us in thanking the wonderful Cheryl from Boston for making this episode possible. In exchange, we send Cheryl links to see our Sunday Night Secret Uncensored stories, as well as our 3 5-hour archive videos. That's 15 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. You can see them too by joining at the $3 level or above, either at our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or by becoming a channel member by clicking the join link below this very video. And now, the video you've been waiting all year for. The story we had no choice but to name. The last Dogman story of 2020. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my wife somehow took over caring for another family's great aunt when that family moved down south for the pandemic. All of a sudden, it became her unpaid job to drive over an hour each way 3 times a week, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, delivering food and supplies to a kindly old lady that neither of us had ever met before. I asked her why the old lady didn't just move down south with the rest of her family, and I was greeted with scorn and derision. How heartless I was, suggesting that the nice old woman should have to uproot herself in the twilight of her golden years. What kind of a monster was I? My wife, I think, really loved the drama of this heavy burden of work each week, but when I would ask her about the lady, my wife would say the strangest things about her. She would sort of indicate that the woman was crazy, but I didn't know exactly what kind of crazy. Fun-loving crazy? Losing her mind crazy? Dangerously crazy? It was something that could be interpreted so many different ways. Then came December, and my wife had to go visit her relatives in Canada for a week due to a family tragedy. She left me in charge of all the shopping for the old lady, although she took care of as much of it as she could for me in advance. I had a separate list for each of the 3 days, and I was in charge of picking up the fresh fruits and vegetables myself. After working out all the details for each of my voyages into the unknown that week, my wife sat me down to talk to me about the old lady herself. I was finally going to get more details about her so that I could understand what brand of Looney Tune she was. My wife told me that Marge, not her real name, was a bit delusional. She thought she was seeing monsters on her property. But I shouldn't take her seriously, my wife said, chuckling. I asked my wife how she knew that Marge wasn't actually seeing something weird that she couldn't explain, and my wife laughed out loud, complimenting my sense of humor. I guess they don't have monsters up in Canada where she hails from. On that Monday, which I guess would have been this past December 7th, 2020, I arrived after an hour of driving on half-filled roads and highways to find Marge in a complete state. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and she had clearly been crying. I was unprepared for all that and felt extremely uncomfortable. She began to tell me that the dog-headed men had figured out how to get into the house at night, but it was okay, because this house had secret panels that the dogman didn't know how to open. She told me she had been sleeping in the walls, like a rat, and then she began to weep. I tried to keep a cheery tone in my voice as though I were my wife, and I got out of there as soon as I could. Wow, that had been more than uncomfortable. The entire time driving home up until I drove back on Wednesday morning, I felt so sad and sorry for Marge. Whether she was really seeing monsters or not was beside the point. She was living as miserably as if there were actually monsters there. I began to think that maybe it was time for Marge's family to get her professional help. I resolved to talk to her on Wednesday, to ask her how she would feel about moving into a home. I was curious, who was responsible for this woman? Was she a legally competent adult? I wanted to find out so I could help this woman be less unhappy and scared. I wondered if she was really sleeping inside the walls, thinking there were monsters in her house. This time on Wednesday when I got there, I found her less frantic than last time and far more resigned to her situation. She managed to be polite to me and even had tea ready for us to sit and share and chat over. Rather than have the conversation I had intended to have with her, I asked her about the cleaning up she was obviously in the middle of when I came in. Once again, she told me that there had been dog-headed men in her house the previous night as she slept in the walls. They had messed the place up, and one of them even took a big crap in the hallway. She didn't cry about it this time. She didn't raise her voice. She sighed heavily, and I could tell that clearly she was not going to allow herself to become depressed over her lot in life. I remember feeling a sense of alarm inside, and I shivered all over. When Marge said dog-headed men, I was envisioning guys in suits with shoes on, but with, dog heads. I was frightened by the surreal nature of Marge's mind, and I wondered if she might have trashed the house herself and blamed it on the dog-headed men. I asked Marge outright if she shouldn't reconsider moving down south with her family. She laughed at the suggestion the first time I ever heard her laugh. Marge sounded very sane when she laughed that day. She told me that she had wanted to go down south with her relatives, but they had told her they didn't have enough room for her. I felt so bad for having brought up such a painful subject, but either my wife explained it incorrectly to me or else I misunderstood what she said. This poor lady was convinced she was under attack in her home, and she had been denied the option of moving out of there with her family. Again, Marge was all I could think about between then and Friday. I even got on FaceTime or Zoom or whatever it was with my wife, and I asked her if we could take Marge in for a while, just to see what happens. We have 4 bedrooms total, and we're only using 1, so we had the space. I just didn't know if Marge was going to go psycho on us and do us both in while we slept, and then say we were dog-headed men when the police showed up. My wife said she talked to the family about it, then called me back not 5 minutes later saying the family was fine with us doing whatever we wanted to do with Marge. They really didn't care about her, and so my wife and I decided we would give Marge a nice Christmas, if she wanted to come stay with us. I decided to talk to her about it in person on Friday. As I drove out there on Friday morning, the sun was battling to peek out from behind the clouds in the sky. When I arrived, though, the sky darkened, and it began to almost feel like night during the day. I rang the doorbell and listened to hear Marge say she was coming from the inside. I also thought I heard a sort of a panting sound, which creeped me out. I was looking around and attempting to locate the source of it when Marge opened the door and greeted me. She had a polite smile on her face, which still wore a weary expression. We went inside and I helped Marge put away her supplies as we had a conversation. It didn't take much to convince her to come live with me and my wife, and her mood lightened considerably. We decided to wait until my wife was back from her family situation on Monday before we moved Marge in. It would give the 3 of us time to prepare on both sides of the issue. I told her the size and layout of her room, and she began fussing, deciding which of her many things she would bring with her to remind her of home and family. Even after all she'd been through, she didn't want to forget her home and her family. While Marge was going through her clothes and keepsakes, I got distracted by a bush outside of Marge's back window. I don't really know what was so interesting about the bush. I guess it must have been moving in a strange way in my side vision. Staring directly toward it, I was waiting for it to move again. And then, suddenly, something happened that changed everything in my entire life. Something darted out, like a cockroach from behind that bush, across a row of about 4 or 5 trees, and then off into some foliage and gone into the woods. It moved so quickly that it couldn't have been more than a 2 or 3 second experience, but still, I got to see the thing clearly in the ambient lighting of a gray and not quite rainy, overcast morning. In some ways, you can see better on those days because the light is reflected back from everywhere by the humid air. Under certain circumstances, you can make out more details than you can in bright sunlight, although I admit that color perception is cut way down. Maybe that's why this thing looked dark gray to me. I compared it to a cockroach, but obviously what I saw was not an insect. I was seeing this at a distance of maybe 90 or 100 feet away from where I was standing, and the creature seemed alarmingly large to me. The size of it intimidated me even though it was running parallel, not at me. It was so big that its existence itself scared me. Also its nakedness. I could see its muscles moving under its hairy legs and butt. I saw it kick up dirt and dust as it ran. It looked like a huge, hairy, dark gray man. And on top of its wide shoulders rested what looked an awful lot like a dog head. I made a pathetic sound like a weak-kneed fool and lost control of my bladder as though I were about to pass away. Kind of an overreaction, I'm sure you're thinking. But anyone thinking that way clearly never saw Dogman in person. Because that's what it had to be. Not a man in a suit with a dog head, but a hairy cryptid species that has a head which really does seem to be almost exactly like a wolf or a feral canine cranium. Marge wasn't crazy, at least not about the dog-headed monster men. I mean, let's face it, if Marge were crazy, she wouldn't have been standing there pointing, laughing at the dark stain on my pants. Marge grabbed what she could carry, and we both left that place to return to the boring safety of my home. I went back on sunny days to get the rest of Marge's stuff, bringing my wife with me both times. My wife still thinks the entire idea of dog-headed men is laughable, no matter what Marge or I tell her. And I think because my wife doesn't believe in Dogman, it just doesn't come around when she's there. I mean, I didn't believe in it either until I saw one, but I don't think my wife would think Dogman was a real thing even if it came up and bit her in the behind. Poor Marge. I really do think she was sleeping in hidden passages, and I also think she had Dogman coming into her own home at night anytime they wanted to. The stories were terrifying enough when I thought they were delusions, but to think that she had to actually deal with that kind of a thing on a daily basis, after having been rejected by her family the way she was, I think Marge did an incredible job of keeping her self-esteem up enough to find a way to cope with what came her way. I really am enjoying having her stay with us as she is a strong person. Stronger than I am, that's for certain. Now that we're all safe and comfy and had a fun Christmas together, I'm thinking that the most appropriate title for this story would be The Last Dogman Story of 2020. Happy New Year, everybody.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. If you have a scary experience you want to tell us about, you can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.